Just a reminder to all of you, we have about 10 minutes so we can address questions to Mr. Woolsey. By the way, great job. Thank you very much. It's your opportunity to come down to the microphones again. They're at the base of the stairs. No question too big or small. Feel free to get up. As you also know, those who are watching via webcast, you can send us via email your questions as well. Let me go ahead and get started with you since I want people to have the opportunity to make their way to the microphone. You had, in previous papers that I had read, and you certainly alluded to it here today, the ability for batteries to be a much larger component, in addition to liquid fuels, because, of course, we like that sense of comfort that comes with knowing there's fuel in the tank should the electricity or the battery run down. But I think you'd commented that maybe we're 2 or 3 years away. But if you can, share with us some more information on the plug-ins and the ability to charge those batteries and then essentially give back to the grid.
Yeah, this is interesting. You know, for way over 100 years, nothing happened in batteries except the lead-acid batteries. It turned out we didn't have to put water in them. Otherwise, nothing happened for all practical purposes. And then, a few years ago, consumer electronics changed the battery business fundamentally. Nobody wants to have to plug these things in all the time. And so batteries started getting better and better in response to consumer demand, lithium-ion particularly. And what has now happened is that we have batteries, the basics of which were developed for consumers, but versions of lithium-ion batteries, some of the newer ones without any cobalt in the cathode, which is what the problem was with some of the fires in the Dell computers and so forth, that are going to make it possible within a few years to have, instead of, say, a kilowatt-hour battery, a 5 to 10 kilowatt-hour battery in your car at affordable price and reasonable size and weight. That would let you drive some 20 to 40 miles on off-peak power, and in much of the country, off-peak power goes for around a nickel a kilowatt-hour at night, which is something in the ballpark of a 1 to 2 cents, let's say, per mile driving, whereas gasoline today is close to double that, 12, 14 cents a mile. So in the first place, you're reducing your driving costs by something close to an order of magnitude, because most cars only go about 30 miles. The average car goes about 30 miles a day in the U.S. If you have a 40-mile battery and you're an average car, you're going to be going for a long time, day after day after day, without going to the filling station at all. The second thing is Commissioner Wellinghoff of the Energy Regulatory Commission and a professor at University of Delaware, Willett Kempton, have both written extensively on what's called V2G, vehicle to grid. Let's say you've got a plug-in hybrid. You get home at 6 o'clock, you plug it in, and after 5 or 6 hours, around midnight, its battery is topped up, and it's ready for you to go the next day. You have an agreement with your local utility that you leave it plugged in, and it's now available for what the utilities call ancillary services, for spinning reserves, that is, to deal with outages, and for regulation of the grid's voltage. Those availabilities, which have to be paid for now by utilities, mainly for natural gas plants, those availabilities, even if they're not used, are worth something to utilities. And Commissioner Wellinghoff talks in terms of that being worth a couple of $1,000 or so a year to an owner of a plug-in hybrid. That means that you are in the ballpark of being able to drive at a tenth the cost of what you're driving at now and get some chunk of your car payments, let's say a third or something, paid for by your local utility. So this is a different thing than having to make the case on the margin, the case that this is going to be a few cents and you ought to, cheaper for you and you really ought to do it, or even a few cents more expensive and you really ought to do it. Those types of financial interests, I think, will have a great deal to do with this transition to plug-in hybrids, and will help protect the principle that one can go forward also, I think, with the alternative liquid fuels and not see them undercut by some major Saudi or OPEC reduction in oil prices, as has happened in the mid-'80s and again for other reasons in the late '90s.
You think we're 2 or 3 years away, though?
Well, General Motors keeps saying they're going into production in 2010 with the Volt, and that it will have probably about a 10 kilowatt-hour battery and about 40 miles on an overnight charge. They haven't backed off that. If it's 2011, it's no disaster. I hope it's 2010. And they also say that's going to be a flexible fuel vehicle, so it will also be able to use 85% ethanol or probably methanol, butanol, etc. By the way, if you have a hybrid that gets 50 miles a gallon, and by plugging it in, you're getting 125 miles a gallon, kind of average for a longish day's drive, and it's running on 85% ethanol, you're getting about 500 miles per gallon of gasoline. Okay? That's, to me, more interesting than going from 25 miles a gallon to 35 miles a gallon with the CAFE standards.
All right. Go ahead. Tell us your name.
My name is Lynn Hood. I'm from Hood Marketing here in Atlanta. And I want...
You just turned it on. Yeah.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you about nuclear power versus coal. We just had a coal power plant turned down for certification in Kansas. That won't be built, and they're saying that may be the case from now on. And nuclear plants are back on the drawing board. Where do you see the future for both of these energy sources?
Well, the first place I'd go is where California went in changing the rules and making it more profitable for utilities to invest than to produce new electricity. But having said that, it seems to me that there are some substantial advantages to nuclear. We know it doesn't put out substantial amounts of carbon. It is got some ancillary problems right now because Wall Street hasn't really wanted to invest in nuclear for some time, but really because of 3 Mile Island, so it needs federal insurance. And that's kind of what the argument is in Washington about insurance from the federal government for how much it's worth. And then you have some production bottlenecks because we've been out of production for a long time, both in labor and in containment vessels, which are only made in one place in Japan, and so on and so on. There are problems. But if you get past those, if you compare nuclear, which in terms of not emitting carbon is kind of a bird in the hand, carbon capture and sequestration for coal is sort of a bird in the bush. Capture you can do with integrated gasification combined cycle coal and probably some other ways. But sequestration reliably deep in the earth, Ernest Moniz of MIT, who knows more about this issue than anybody I know, Nobel Prize winner, says it's about 10 years and $10 billion worth of experimentation and R&D to make sure you can do that, and then you need probably a carbon dioxide price of $35 to $40 a ton. In order to make it equitable with other ways of producing electricity, and that's about 35 to 40 times what carbon dioxide costs per ton in the European Kyoto system. So, I know of those two, with patents qualification that you don't want to spread nuclear around the world, I think I would tilt toward nuclear.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Go ahead. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Hi, Steve Davenport from Wilmington Trust here in Atlanta. I'm concerned about the price of oil and our relationship in the Middle East. It seems that we have this premium that's built into the price of oil that keeps going up. Is there any way for us to turn the price of oil premium because of volatility in our relationships in the Middle East?
It's not, I think, just our relationships. Some of our relationships we've handled well, some we've handled poorly. It's that panoply of problems about the influence of Wahhabism, of the nuclear arms race between the Shia and the Sunni, a number of those things that we didn't invent and we didn't create. But it's very hard for us to, in any fashion, coming from the outside, to just sort of calm down that part of the world. There's a lot of chaos and even more potential chaos there. So I don't see that we can do better than continue to use oil for what oil is useful for. We shouldn't be trying to say we import no oil. We should be trying, I think, to do to oil what refrigeration did to salt at the end of the 19th century. It effectively destroyed salt as a strategic commodity because it was the only way then to preserve meat. In a few years, electricity and refrigeration changed all that, and we now have salt. We use salt. People pay for salt. There's international trade in salt. It's useful stuff. But nobody dominates their neighbor because they have salt mines. And that was actually true to some extent back before the late 19th century. People fought wars over salt. That's all gone with the wind. What we want is for oil to just be a normal commodity that people use for what it's useful for, but not something that has a 96% monopoly on our transportation, and therefore has the kind of whip hand, the producers in the countries that own it, that has a whip hand over aspects of our behavior. That's the problem we got to solve.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Go ahead and tell us your name and where you're from.
My name is Ann Harper, and I'm with Green Law here in Atlanta. We are public interest lawyers for the environment. I loved your allegorical tale of John Muir and General Patton, and I think that what you've sketched out for us is exactly the issue, which is not one of technology or science, but it's one of politics. What we really face is a failure of dialogue, and I noticed that you mentioned a couple of times the public utility commissions. In our state, in Georgia, as well in other states across the country, we have utility commissions in bed with utilities, and we have a political problem as much as anything. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we can address the future dialogue that really has to take place, whether it's between a dove like Muir and a hawk like Patton, or a Republican and a Democrat. Most of us in the environmental movement believe that those are irrelevant distinctions now. We've really got to come together in new ways.
Right. I think I want to stress California certainly didn't do everything right with respect to energy. It had the Enron business, the blackouts, and so forth. But this policy of figuring out what to reward and rewarding investment in new technology and energy savings instead of rewarding sales was a huge decision that the California PUC made about 20 years ago. And it has been very important, and with some more incentives for energy savings, which are now coming along the line in California, it can, I think, show a lot of states what can be done. California utilities work very well in this system. They make profits for their shareholders. They're not in the business of ignoring shareholders' interests. But because the rule that they are following is one that encourages conservation, it changes the utilities' motivations, and it in turn changes their behavior. And like I say, Idaho has followed, and other states are now starting to examine this a bit. I can't think of a single program that would be more likely to change behavior than to wed up that California change of 20 years ago with some added incentives to save energy, some of these things like maybe financing some of the building changes. Some of the building changes make improvements quickly. Painting the roof white does a lot, for example, changing the kind of lights and so on. But some things will take several years for a payback. If the federal government or a state government could basically loan on the basis of later returns from the payback from other energy saving steps that owners of buildings would take. Also, there's some sort of screwy incentives. I mean, most landlords get to mark up their utility bill to their tenants, so they don't have a big incentive to have less energy use. If you change the way the leases are written and gave people an incentive still to make money, but not to make it by having electricity wasted, it would help a lot. And I think those incentive changes are the kinds of things to focus on together with legislatures and public utility commissions.
All right. Ann, thank you. Just so we're all clear, I am being told in my ear that we are out of time for questions for Jim. However, Jim is agreed to stay with us through the presentation. It's okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to have you ask your question. But if you do have something that you would like to address to Jim, hold on to it because we can do that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Tell me your name and where you're from.
Keith McInnish from Seagull Software here in Atlanta. Thank you, Mr. Woolsey. I appreciate your message tonight. I've been asking, for a few years now, why is it that we allow ourselves to transfer wealth at $1 billion a day to people who want to kill us? And it seems to me that until we have the political will of this country to achieve energy independence, we're going to always be beholden to people that we don't necessarily support, and we're going to be compromising ourselves as a nation, as a people. And I look back to major infrastructure investment and changes, like in the Depression when Franklin said, we're going to put people to work, we're going to invest in the infrastructure of the country. We came out with the TVA, we came out with the Hoover Dam, we came out with the things that not only helped us in the moment, but they invested in the future that allow us to live the way we live today. You look at the interstate system that Eisenhower put in place and how that enabled transportation and the growth for the United States and the boom in the 60s. Why can't we get the political will and the wherewithal to, instead of blow people up, invest in the infrastructure here in the United States to build energy independence in funding research in universities and building alternative energy sources and all of these things that we need so that oil can become that commodity that we don't care about anymore?
I'm going to give a very short answer.
Okay. That's all right.
I think that what is beginning to happen in this country is driven by the grassroots. Interest groups are following that, and some odd coalitions are coming together. I talk about sometimes a coalition between the tree huggers, the do-gooders, the sodbusters, the cheap hawks, the evangelicals, the utility shareholders, the mom-and-pop drivers, and Willie Nelson. And when you see strange coalitions coming together, politicians notice. Now, part of the problem is in Congress, it's kind of the sum of all lobbies, and you get kind of, a subsidy for this and a subsidy for that rather than a coherent approach. But I think that we are on the edge of making some very fundamental changes. We're a little bit like, no, we're a lot like what Winston Churchill said about us. He said, the Americans always do the right thing, but unfortunately it's only after they've exhausted all other possibilities.
Okay. Jim, thank you very much. Jim is going to stay with us.